All right. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Archaeology with Flint. And I'm here with Dr. Beth Hart, who I met actually, 21 years ago in Abydos, Egypt, where we
Yes.
were working together to excavate around the Shuna and other mortuary complexes. And so, in the wake of the me going on Joe Rogan experience, she suggested, look, she's an expert in Egyptology and the archaeology of Egypt. And in particular, she studies stone tools from mortuary complexes, from areas where, the dead were buried. And so she suggested that she could walk us through the evidence for the development of sort of, funerary monumental culture in Egypt and sort of the long process on this. So, hi, Beth. It's really great to
Hi.
have you here. And I don't know, I guess first tell me, how did you get involved in getting into Egyptology and studying ancient Egypt?
It's great to be here, Flynn. Thanks for letting me talk about something I'm so excited about. I got interested in ancient Egypt when I was a kid from a book in third grade, and it just went from there. I studied it in undergrad, and then, spent years working on excavations in Egypt and went back to grad school and all that. And I just got really interested in the early periods of Egypt under like how did we end up with ancient Egypt as we know it? What were people doing to lead up to that? And so that was what I focused on. And in the process, I started studying the settlements from those time periods and then focused on the stone tools and then broadened out into other time periods and other focuses.
That makes sense. It's very true. When people sort of look at the pyramids, there's this idea that they just appear out of nowhere. And, you need to really go back, thousands of years to look at what's going on in Egypt to understand how they got there in the first place, if you see what I mean, right?
Exactly, exactly. And that's what kind of what I wanted to talk about today is like, if you're just looking at the pyramids on their own, it's easy to look at components like the Sphinx temple or the Sphinx and go like, oh, this is such an anomaly. But when you look at these in the context of over time, how they develop over time, all the different components, they all really make sense together. And it's more challenging to see individual pieces as like an anomaly. So that's a perspective I want to take and just give people some of that context of what was happening and the 1,000 years leading up to the Giza pyramids and all that we see there.
And are we seeing this chronologically right here in this slide, I'm guessing? Sort of
More
from
or less,
top to
yeah, yeah,
bottom?
yeah. Although focused on just the superstructures, but of course I'll talk about the other components as well. Yeah, so
Okay.
some highlights of things that are still standing or reconstructions at the top.
I recognize the one on the middle left.
I bet you do. Yes. And that's actually me in the little red jacket you can barely see on the corner of that one. So
Aha. It's probably a photo taken after I was there. Jeez.
it might be, it might be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
Well, then walk us through this progression. Let's see what
great.
happens.
Let's jump into it. And I'll just go back. I'll say like there's all kinds of evidence about the pyramids and about these royal burial complexes. And I'm just going to focus on the tomb development today. I'd love to also get into the hard stonework development, but I think we'll have to save that for another time because I have a lot to talk about today.
Yeah.
And for me, this is just the most convincing aspect of really understanding the pyramid complexes is seeing how they develop over time.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, especially if you're gonna make the argument of where do they come from, whether it's an Atlantis culture or whether it's the locals, you need to understand the local evidence first. And so see that
Right.
progression.
Yeah. And so, like, to orient everybody with the kind of time periods and where we're at, over on the right, if we look at Giza and the Sphinx and the Giza pyramids, generally those are dated to around 2500 BCE. And so I'm going to go all the way back into the predynastic period, some phases we call the Nagata period, in around 3500 BC, and start there and look at some early, elite tombs. And then I'll take us into the first kings of Egypt and those first royal tombs, and then to the first pyramid, the pyramids in between, and then finally, after 1,000 years, the Giza pyramids. So that's a plan today is to walk you through what we see for all of these.
How do they
For
date
a
these
number of these.
earlier sites? Are they mostly based off of radiocarbon or stylistic of pottery or what?
Yeah, it's both. So actually
Okay.
the seriation dating of pottery was invented in Egypt by Petrie from looking at the predynastic cemetery remains and looking at the pottery in those cemeteries. But of course, now we have other radiocarbon dating, and there was a project within the last decade to re-look at some of those radiocarbon dates and take like dates from things that are short-lived, and well as using newer statistical modeling methods to look at the radiocarbon dates. So especially for these earlier dates, I'm trying to reflect some of the most recent thinking, but it shifts things by like 50 or 100 years, not like 1,000 years. So it's
Yeah,
really
of
about
course.
fine tuning.
Yeah,
Yeah,
that makes
yeah.
sense. And so, just for people that might be listening and that don't know what we mean by short-lived organisms, when you radiocarbon date something, you're sort of dating when that tissue grew. And so, for like a tree, you could imagine a long-lived tree. Parts of it grow much earlier in its life, while other parts grow much later. Plus, it can sit around for a bit before being used or before being deposited.
Hmm.
While if you date something like an animal bone or like a seed from a crop, that's
Hmm.
going to be short-lived, and you know that it was grown that year or in that decade or something like that. And so it's
Hmm.
something we focus on now. We focus less on wood than archaeologists in the past used to focus on. Yeah.
And the project that I'm currently working with, I was just in Egypt a week ago. I'm still jet lagged. Is at the tomb of Merenith, one of the early rulers of Egypt, Merenith, and they are doing OSL dating of a lot of the different components in the tomb to try to look at, different phases of use in the tomb, different phases of building. So we're also kind of adding that to the scientific dating methods for these early materials.
Okay, fantastic. Yeah, I knew
But
OSLs
results
was the chemistry.
not out yet.
Yeah. Dating takes time. We don't go in with assumptions about date. We wait to see what comes back from the lab.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. So before getting into the first set of tombs I want to look at, I want to just set the stage of looking at these royal tombs, not as just like a pyramid, but as whole complexes that have multiple components. I have like kind of the list on the left here of some of these major components that we see kind of going in and out of use. And we see lots of these in many of the different royal burial complexes. So I want to look at them as these whole complexes.
Hmm.
And so these are the components that I'll go through and we'll kind of look at here.
Yeah, and I mean anything archaeological is going to be based off of so much evidence. That's what we look at is the totality of so much stuff and
Yes.
different patterns with it. Yeah.
Yes. And so even with these, you have to look at like everything around it, everything in the area, and how these all fit together.
Hmm.
And they form kind of like patterns of use altogether. So for the first site, we're going to go way down south of Cairo, south of Giza to Hierakonpolis, which is south of Luxor and north of Aswan. And we're going to about 3,500 BCE. This is kind of the earliest example where we can see a lot of these royal tomb complex components. Now, I will say at this early stage, you know, kingship, are they considered kings? That's a whole other different theoretical debate. How much area did they rule? But we can definitely tell that these are elite tombs, very different from the other cemeteries in the area. And we see a lot of these later components. So this is kind of a Google Earth map of the Hierakonpolis area with some of the areas called out. You can see the green is the modern day kind of alluvium and farmland, and it's relatively close to where it would have been anciently. And then on the edge of that, where the desert comes up, is where we have a lot of the settlements and cemeteries.
Okay.
And this is on the west side of the Nile, which that's the most consistent component of royal burial complexes, is being on the west side of the Nile.
Were people mostly
And
living on the west side then, or living on both sides?
the people would live on both sides. So we have a settlement here, and then just farther back in the desert, we have the cemetery.
Okay.
But all of the royal burial cemeteries are on the west side of the Nile, and probably based on later religious texts and everything, that's thought that your soul goes into the west when you die. The sun sets in the west, and we can see that those kind of elite and royal cemeteries are on the west side of the Nile, even from early on, and all of the later kings' tombs are on the west side of the Nile.
Okay, perfect.
So here you have like at the edge of where the Nile alluvium and like farmland would have been, but on the desert you have settlements and you have some cemeteries for regular people. But then if you follow a natural wadi, which is a little valley, back into the desert, you get to this HK6 cemetery. It's the site is called Hierakonpolis, so they abbreviate it HK. One of the components that we see later is a processional route or causeway. And so is this natural wadi an early processional route or natural valley? It's possible. We'll see it in later ones, and then we'll see the eventual causeways.
How deep is this wadi?
It's kind of shallow. It's not
Okay.
not super deep. I think it's, I want to say like 6 meters on a side, like height
Okay.
on the side, and like width, I mean, I don't know, 20 meters, something like that. It's not like a super like narrow valley or anything. It's kind of
Yeah.
wide, but like you can, I mean, you can see it right here on Google Earth that the probably formed by, you know, rain and water runoff from the higher desert.
Mm-hmm.
So if we head out to that cemetery there, what they found when they excavated this were a lot of pits and trenches for fence posts. So what you're looking at here is a map of all these features that they've excavated in the ground. You can see one I want to point out on the bottom. So there is an enclosure fence around this cemetery. And so that was made of like reed with plaster, like mud plaster over it and like white plaster over it. And that kind of surrounded this area.
Mm-hmm.
And so already the cemetery was set back in the desert away from the settlement, making it kind of exclusive and private. And then it also has this kind of enclosure wall going around it.
Mm-hmm.
I also wanted to point out, like, because a lot of times people look at the Giza temples and sphinxes and look at the orientations and alignment, and you can see there's a lot oriented slightly different different ways here. They're not all kind of lined up and facing the same way.
Yeah.
So for the burial component of these, we would see pits in the ground. So I'll point out some of the different ones here. So this one with the 72, that was just like kind of a shallow pit in the ground. This one, 23, is kind of a square pit. It might have had a brick lining. So they're just pits dug into the ground. And then in many cases, we have indications of a superstructure. So we see the holes for posts, and they've found some, in some cases, bits of the wooden posts left in place. They found remains of fencing. So there was probably like a wood and reed superstructure over these.
When were these excavated?
So, oh, these have been excavated over the past like 30 years, I would say.
Okay.
So it's relative, and they're still excavating. So this is site of Hierakonpolis, and you can go to this website, hierakonpolisonline.org, and they have like a little Neccan news magazine that publishes, that they put out after every excavation season. That shows like a lot of what they're finding, so it's really easy to follow along. They have a lot of stuff
Cool.
published online for people
Perfect.
to get. So you have the burial component, you have a wooden reed superstructure over it, and then also at here, they've also found buildings within this complex that don't have any burials associated with them. So you can really see this one down in the bottom here. It's just all of these pits for basically columns that would have been made out of bundles of reeds, probably.
Huh.
Yeah. And then this, what you're looking at on the lower left here, the very colorful one, is a reconstruction of what they think, you know, this might have looked like.
But even though there's no burials, this is still associated with kind of funerary rituals or offerings or something like that.
Yeah, so you can see it's within this fenced complex of the cemetery. And we actually found offerings in the corners of these, like kind of small shallow pits, where I say they found small shallow pits filled with all kinds of different little figurines. And one I think you'll really appreciate, these include small figures of animals flaked out of flint. And these
Ah,
are So you can see kind of like a gazelle, antelope animal here, as well as like other figurines made in all different kinds of materials. You've got things carved out of ivory, you've got arrowheads, there's pottery
Oh
in
yeah.
kind of in the corners and associated with these buildings that don't have any tombs in them, that are nonetheless within the fenced burial enclosure area. So it seems like it's a place for offerings or ritual activities associated with funeral activities.
Okay. Yeah. I mean, I love these Nakata crazy flints. They're,
Yeah,
they're so crazy.
yeah, they're so impressive. I have a picture of some more of them in a minute. We can get to there. So
Huh.
another thing we find, another element of these royal burial complexes can be like an image of the tomb owner or ruler. And so at this site, they found these early ceramic funerary masks. So a lot of people, when they think of Egypt, think of King Tutankhamun's funerary mask. That's like super like iconic of Egypt. And so here, thousands of years before that, we have an early example of funerary masks in an elite cemetery. And these are made of out of pottery. And probably the very pointy bit is probably representing a beard.
Okay. Yeah. One of those. Yeah. Beards. What are those
Mhm.
called? Yeah. And then the ears are really crazy.
Yeah, yeah. The ears are there's a focus on the ears, and then there's actually little holes behind them where you could see they put a string for tying it onto the body.
Aha. Okay.
So it really seems like it was a mask and not just like a freestanding
Yeah,
sculpture.
exactly. Put on.
And then also in this cemetery, we have evidence for probably one of the earliest near life-size statues in Egypt. So this was found in just fragments in the Tomb 23 offering chapel. So this statue is completely broken up, but you can see the nose, you can see the ears, they're
Hmm.
these round ears, just like on the other side. And they found just all these broken up bits. But we don't have the full thing all together. I think they've tried to piece it together, but it's just lots of tiny pieces. So, but we have associated with one of these tombs a near life-size image of probably the tomb owner.
Very cool. They should
Uh,
make statues of me.
out of flint, right?
Yeah, seriously, that's the way to go.
So then with these complexes, not only do you have the burial, the superstructure, but then you have other burials around them. And so what you're looking at on the bottom left are burials that have indications of fencing around them that are all kind of connected to this main tomb, tomb 16 in the lower left.
Hmm.
And in these burials around them, they found burials of other humans. And then outside that, burials of animals as well. So all through this cemetery, you find like a central burial of a human and then other humans and animal burials around it.
And a
Yeah.
wide diversity of animals. It's got what?
Yeah.
Elephants, baboons, aurochs, goats. It's got a wide range of stuff.
Yes, there's so many different kinds. They found domesticated animals like cattle, dogs, donkeys, goats, even a pig, sheep. And then the really interesting thing is all the wild animals that are
Hmm.
potentially harder to get and dangerous. So they found crocodiles, baboons, elephants, hippos, and then like the desert animals like the gazelle and the hartebeest. There's one leopard that they found, and then also wild cats and wild donkeys. So it's
Huh.
just like it's a menagerie here.
Absolutely wild.
Yeah, definitely. And I especially interesting, I think, is this crocodile. You can see it's actually outside of the corner of that fence. The crocodiles are known for being, dangerous animals, but they can also be protective. Like, is he protecting the corner?
Hmm.
You can see there. We've got here's the leopard down here. That's number 50 associated with that one. Ostrich, all kinds of wild desert animals. Dogs, there's some cases of dogs buried with like kind of a handler.
Okay.
So there's some dogs buried with a human around this complex, I believe. The elephant had jewelry with it. It had wrappings, like it was treated in a very special way.
Huh. Very, very crazy.
Yeah.
I guess you
So
don't want to necessarily have the job of being the baboon handler or the dog handler, though, because you might end up being sacrificed also.
Well, so the question of sacrifice is really a good one. I would say we can't definitively say either way. A tomb complex, especially like, because the burials are all separate. There's the fences connecting them.
Hmm.
So they're all probably built in a relatively short time span when these reed, fences are still standing and
Okay.
able to be connected. But that debate we'll see continues for some later subsidiary graves as well. So it's hard to say either way, and it's a debate that many people who study this time period get very fiery about. Here's a better image showing you all kind of the different animals and how many they found of each of them. The baboon, this elephant, and this tomb. Pretty amazing.
Yeah, it's nuts. I've not studied this many species. In all the million animal bones from Greece I've come across, I've never found a hippo or any of these really.
There's some of the burials with the dogs have like 10 dogs together. And so they write about
Wow.
like, oh, they're zoo archaeologists trying to sort out the finger bones of like 10 dogs intermingled and like a lot of challenges.
Yeah, good luck with that. Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, a lot of great work here. And with the leopard, it's obviously like a large wild cat, but they have a whole article looking at, is this a small lion or a large leopard? And they think it's a large leopard, but it's kind of that you have to plot like the size ranges of the bones of the two
Yeah.
different types and see where it lands. So of course I wanted it to be a lion for a closer analogy to the Sphinx, but leopard, large wild cat is what we
Big
have.
wildcat, like a sphinx.
Yeah. And then of course I had to include an image of some of these flint figurines. So most of these are represented in the burials. Like you can see this top one, here's the donkey, and then below that is a hippo.
Hmm.
But not all of them. Like they haven't found a burial of a giraffe yet. I'm sure they'll keep looking. Who knows? Maybe they will.
Huh.
And so on. So these are pretty amazing and pretty special to this site.
Yeah, they're very nice.
All right, so one last component I want to look at for the Hierakonpolis tombs, which is temples near the settlement. So in the later, like in the Giza complexes, we see there's a temple adjacent to the burial, and then there's a temple down closer to the settlement. And so we do have in that area that I showed you on the first map where the settlements are, there are remains of what are probably early temples.
Hmm.
These are large, like I think this one on the lower right is like, it's like 30 meters long. It's this oval shape that you don't see in any other structures. It has this large open courtyard, and they found huge amounts of remains from making really fancy bifacial tools there, along with all sorts of like special pottery, and also remains of wild animals like they find at HK6 that you don't find in other areas. And so it's unusual in the size, it's unusual in the kind of assemblage, the variety and the types found in the assemblage of stone tools, animals, pottery. And so it's something unusual going on here. I think the reconstruction above, I think they've changed their ideas since this picture was there, but just to give you something to look at better than a map of like post holes and fences. And then this one on the left is another like basically columned hall where they have just these series of posts in a rectangular building, or a series of post holes in a rectangular building. And this was found with huge amounts of burnt bifacial tool fragments there. So something unusual going on in this area as well. And both of these are near the settlement. So we
Okay.
definitely have some special structures down in the settlement. It's harder to say, we can't really say at this point if they had a direct relationship to the funerary remains, or if these are more for celebrating and religious activities during life.
Yeah.
But we do have something there.
Cool stuff. Definitely.
Yeah.
The Nakata are nuts. I love the
Yeah.
Nakata. They have such great art and
Me too. So here on our left, you're looking at one of this figurine of a woman. It's really just like very different from ancient Egypt, but really beautiful and interesting and different. All right. So are we ready to go on to the first kings of Egypt?
yeah, let's go check out this first dynasty.
So the first kings of Egypt are buried at a site called Abydos or Abydos, where you and I first met. And that is a bit farther to the north. It's north of Luxor, north of Hierakonpolis, but still well south of Giza and the pyramids. And so we're also moving up in time a few hundred years to about 3100, 3000 BC.
And you've been working at Abydos sort of straight since then. So for
Yeah,
like 20 plus years.
off
Yeah.
and on. I've worked at a, variety of others, going around working at other sites. But like tend to come back to Abydos because it's such an interesting site there. There's so much going on there.
Yeah.
So
It's a really fantastic site. Yeah.
okay. So this is a reconstruction from a National Geographic article some years ago, but it actually gives you kind of a better idea of how to visualize the landscape than some of these maps. Again, we're on the west side of the Nile. And then we have, have the cultivation, and you have a settlement on the edge of the cultivation. And then you go back in the desert behind that. You follow a natural valley down and you get to the royal tombs. And in this case, it's very likely that this natural valley was a processional route used for going to the royal tombs.
Okay.
And that's because what we also see here are these funerary enclosures right on the edge of the desert next to the settlements. So based on finds of ceilings that have the king's names on them, we basically have like one funerary enclosure associated with each king and one burial associated with each king. So like there's a very kind of direct relationship between these two.
Finally,
So
things are simple.
a little more straightforward. And so it's very likely that this natural valley connected the two in kind of a processional route there. Okay, so going back to the actual burial component in the desert, again, it's set back in the desert. It's probably more exclusive. Probably not everybody goes out there. But in this case, the desert in this area, it's just very like loose sand. And it's been excavated and re-excavated, since ancient times. And we really don't have any evidence for enclosure walls. We only have a little bit of evidence for what the superstructures of these would have looked like. So as far as we can tell, no enclosure wall out in the desert. In this map, I wanted to show you, you see this cemetery U on the bottom?
Yeah.
So those are even earlier burials that date to the Nagata period. So kind of like the same time as what we were looking at in Hierakonpolis. But over time, this site gets more exclusive and fewer people are buried there until it's just like the kings and the elites. I also wanted to point out that these tombs even don't just pop up out of nowhere. They develop from, local activities in the area.
Yeah.
So we've got tombs in red. You're seeing outlines of the tombs of each of the first dynasty kings and two second dynasty kings. Again, you can see they're not all oriented the same way. Looking at the orientations overall, if you look at that relationship between the cemetery where they're buried and those funerary enclosures, they're oriented, is a north-south relationship between those. But you've been to Abydos. Abydos is a little weird. Although like cardinal directions, it's north-south. That's actually the direction towards the Nile. So it's kind of like local east in a way. So because the Nile makes a curve right there that makes it, instead of running like this, it runs like this. So they're oriented towards the Nile, which happens to be north in this case, or northish in this case. And then there's also something else interesting about the orientation and kind of access at the southwest corner. They leave an opening. So you can see here, this one. Even these ones that have subsidiary burials right around them, they leave a little gap.
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah.
And what we think is that's like for the king's soul to have access to go into the west. Although that might be a little southwest in this actual case, but so there is some, they're thinking about the orientations in these and looking at that, but they're not all like exactly the same.
And so in a sense, this local north is oriented off the Nile rather than with the stars or the sun or anything like that. Yeah.
It seems to be, yeah, yeah. It seems to be oriented according to like where the desert, the high desert is, where the Nile is. It's following these kind of local orientations.
I mean, haven't been there. I don't think you can see the Nile from there, right? So they're actually doing this based off of knowing where the Nile is from where they walked in a sense, or
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the cultivation is right there. So there's
so
you've
you can
got
see
that
the edge
stark
of it. Yeah.
contrast to the desert. And probably the Nile was a lot closer back then than it was today. You know, the Nile shifts in the within the
Hmm.
Nile valley part itself over time. So it was probably was closer than it is today. But so they definitely have like a good sense of where it is. And because like that's really where life is taking place. Life is taking place in the farmland, in the cultivation, on the Nile. You know, boats are really significant, all of this. And the desert is kind of that's other. That's where the dead go. That's where people are buried. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So then, looking at these burial components, looking at these two images, it's actually these center parts in both of these that are the main burial area for the king or queen. They're much larger than what we saw at Hierakonpolis. They're square holes in the ground and they're lined with mud bricks. The linings can be pretty thick on these, like a meter thick in some cases.
Wow.
And then probably they had wooden structures set inside. So this one in the top right, you can see all those little appendages coming out. They would have had a wood structure built inside of that would have effectively made those little storage rooms
Hmm.
in the side. And we still have fragments of that wood left. Most of these tombs were burned over the centuries. So actually ancient Egyptians were the first archaeologists, I like to say, because in later periods, like 1,000 years after this or plus or more, they came back and the ancient Egyptians re-excavated these tombs of the first dynasty rulers in order to figure out which was the tomb of Osiris, a god. And then they identified one of them as the tomb of Osiris, and people would make pilgrimages to the site and leave offerings at this tomb. So they re-excavated these tombs anciently. Um,
So
and,
wait,
and
this is
mhm.
cool. So wait, which one do we know which one is the tomb of Osiris or was
um,
called the tomb of Osiris? And so did we find some of those later offerings?
so it is this one that you're seeing on the right here.
Okay.
Tomb of Jer was the one that they thought would be the tomb of Osiris. And you asked like, did we find any evidence of these offerings that people made? Yes, we found a lot of evidence in the form of pottery.
Hmm.
So the name of this site, I don't know if I said it's Abydos, but the particular cemetery itself is called el Qa-ab,
Hmm.
which in Arabic means mother of the pots or like the potsherds.
Of
And so
course.
there's just heaps and heaps. If you go walk out there, so all this little pink stuff you're seeing on the desert is just like fragments of pottery and just so much of these heaps of pottery of these later styles and types that can be dated to these later time periods.
And these pilgrims that came down there, when are they coming in? Like the New Kingdom period or Roman period or?
I think it starts in the Middle Kingdom period. So I think
Okay.
those excavations are happening in the Middle Kingdom. And then on that processional little chapels, like so little chapels so that your soul can go visit Abydos in the afterlife. I mean, just and also in the town near the Osiris Temple, which was in the town here.
Hmm.
And so there's lots of evidence of this later activity in the pilgrimage site and how these tombs came to be reinterpreted as like part of really closely associated with Osiris.
Which is totally fascinating because Osiris, of course, is the god of the underworld, of the death in a
Mhm,
sense. And so they correctly
mhm.
identify the first dynasty sort of area, and then they say that's where Osiris is buried. Yeah, that's
Yeah,
some good archaeology for the day. You
exactly,
know?
exactly. And this site of Abydos, like they always knew this is where the first rulers came from because it remains like important and in known in king lists and like one of the most famous king lists is in the Seti temple here in Abydos and
Yeah,
so
of
they
course.
know this is where the earliest rulers were buried. They just added Osiris as like a mythical early ruler.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, yeah, exactly. So yeah, so that central part is the burial itself, which are these mud brick chambers underground. And then, so what do the superstructures of these look like? That is a lot harder to answer because, like I said, it's just, you can see even in this image in the lower left, it's just loose desert sand.
Yeah.
So it was hard to preserve a lot of that.
And by the way, if you go to Egypt to excavate, this is why I don't go back to Egypt to excavate, is because there's just sand everywhere. It's in your shoes, it's in the shower, it's in the food. It's just literally
In your
everywhere, and you cannot
hair.
avoid it. Yeah.
Yes. It is very sandy, especially at this site. Yeah.
And for like 6 weeks, you're just eating sand and showering in sand and living in sand. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, on my last day there this last time, I went and like I was leaving at like 4 in the morning or something the next day. So to head back to Cairo. So I took a shower and then I went up on the roof to like have a beer and watch the sunset. And it was so windy and my hair was just blowing everywhere. And like in Cairo the next day, I'm just like feeling the sand still come out. I was like, well, I tried, but
Yeah.
the sand stays with you. Yeah.
That Abydos sand. Yeah.
Yeah. So for the superstructures of these tombs, one thing that we do have evidence for is potentially for a hidden mound inside the substructure, but like just below the superstructure. And so in the tomb of Jet, they have this like a small mud brick wall kind of leaning in, and it seems to have just held and encased like a pile of sand.
Hmm.
And that would have been hidden under whatever was on top of the structure. They hypothesized that these are some kind of mounds, like maybe just mounds of sand encased, held in place with some harder rubble or gravel. This is a potential hypothesized reconstruction of the Tomb of Merit Neith up here, but we don't exactly know what the superstructures looked like.
Okay.
And this idea of the hidden mound, it's kind of important because pyramids are just like pointy mounds. But it's not the only example we have of this from this early time period. So if you go up to Saqqara, which is a site much closer to Giza in Cairo, that we'll
And
talk
famous
about
for
later.
its pyramids.
Yes. So you have tombs of other elite people built in Saqqara. And some of these, one of these has kind of like a stepped structure associated, part of the mastaba or inside it is this step structure. So you can see in this bottom right, this kind of crenellated wall that would have been
Hmm.
the outside of the tomb. And then inside this hidden step structure. And another one
Interesting.
similarly had a hidden mound inside.
These are like hidden pyramids. You're going to blow people's mind. These are the hidden pyramids.
Yeah, there were some. This was how they did it. So this idea of some sort of mound associated with the burials we can at least trace it back this far with actual archaeological evidence.
Very cool.
So next is these we call them funerary structures or funerary enclosures. And these were located close to the settlement where people lived, still on the edge of the desert, but basically right overlooking the settlement. The town site at this time period would have been right here, and these funerary enclosures were on the desert, like right next to it, right above it.
Okay.
I mean, I said public component on here, but we don't know who had access to these and who actually used these, but they were certainly more visible and closer to the settlement. They're making a statement to everybody there. So this is kind of the more public component, at least.
And these are not hidden. These are very visible.
Yes, they're
They're
very
very
visible.
big.
So what you're looking at here is the last one that was built by Khasa Kemwe, the last king of the second dynasty. And this is the only one that's still standing. So although they were not hidden, we think that they dismantled each one after it was done and before they built the next one. So all we have are like the footprints of these, except for the last one, which might have been partially dismantled. You see this one wall in the front is much lower than the rest, but wasn't taken down, luckily for us. And this is the oldest mud brick structure in Egypt. Khafre actually built 2 of these. He also built one at Hierakonpolis.
Hmm.
And so, people like to fight about which one's older. They were built at the same time, and by the same king. So close enough. And so, yeah, I think it's one of the oldest mud brick standing structures in the world. Definitely the oldest in Egypt.
Okay. Yeah, it's huge and enormous if you go there.
Yeah, you can see the people for scale there. It's like
Yeah.
larger than a football field inside. And so one thing I want to point out in this photo is this the white bit you see at the bottom,
Hmm.
that's white plaster. And it's a series of niches. So like these parts sticking out and parts going back. So the whole thing would have been all the way up these this niched facade, they call it, and all white plaster. So they would have been these kind of shining white structures in the desert.
In a
And
sense, what we can excavate, because we were excavating some of this when I was there, was you can see what it would have looked like when protected from the erosion, the wind erosion that's hit the rest of it. Yeah.
exactly, that's what you're looking at, that kind of white component there. And one of them, from one of the structures next to this, we found a bit of red paint on some of the fallen plaster. So
Ah,
there
cool.
might have been like a stripe or some components that had paint on them as well.
The stripe makes it go faster, right?
So you can see the orientation of these. They run kind of local north-south in direction. The most elaborate entrance for all of these is always on that local north corner.
Which can be
And then, but they,
conceptualized as west.
yeah,
Yeah.
no, west would have been this way, back here.
Oh, all right, all right.
So,
Sorry, I was thinking because of
this
the
is
curve.
more, yeah. I know it's hard and these maps go all different directions. Like this would be local east. So they all have an elaborate entrance on the north, also an entrance slightly less elaborate on the southeast corner of them.
Hmm.
And then just inside, when you go in, there's a structure inside each of these. So you can see one here, you can see one here. There were some remains of one here. We don't have that for all of them, like I said, because they were torn down. So in some cases, we don't even have the remains of that big wall. We just have some of these tombs that were around them. So small building for ritual activities, large open space inside, enclosed. And then one of them, the last one, that one of Khafre, also has an enclosure wall around it as well. Yeah, and then some of them also have an exit to the west, but not all of them.
Okay.
Next, I was going to talk about the images of the tomb owner or the ruler. Now, we don't have statues for these like we saw in Hierakonpolis, but what we do have are these stelae that have the names of the king inscribed in them. So the one all the way on the right here, and that's made out of like a hard limestone. And then this one is the granite stele of King Peribsen. He was a king of the second dynasty, carved out of granite. And we actually have, for Merit Neath, we have 2 of these stela. The second one is fragmentary. This one is still in good shape. And these were found out at the tombs.
Okay.
So that's the main indication that there was something going on at those tombs. Like they had some focal point there for some sort of activity because we have these stela out there. But what it looked like, the rest of what it was, we just don't have evidence for.
Hmm.
And then we also have some of these labels with writing on them. So these are some early examples of writing from this time period. And this one I'm showing you in particular because you can see an image of the king here, and he's kind of running, and he has a headdress, and he has some of his scepters, and he's running. And you see these little markers. They're kind of like half circle shaped markers. We're going to see those again in some of the future structures. So these basically relate to maybe some of the activities that they might have been doing in those funerary enclosures.
Okay. And isn't this the first example of a headdress, if I remember?
Actually, we have rock art that goes back a bit earlier than
A bit
this,
earlier.
more
Okay.
like Dynasty 0. In
Okay.
Aswan, there's this pointed crown and some rock art there, but it's right about this time period. Yeah.
Okay.
And this kind of hooked symbol is the symbol for like a regnal year. It's a symbol for year. So this tag is kind of telling you what was going on in that year of the king's reign.
A whole lot.
Yes. And then, all right, so now let's get to the subsidiary burials. So, like we saw at Hierakonpolis, there were people buried right around that main tomb. And here at Abydos, we also see the same thing. So, I had talked about these central structures of the tombs, but around all of the tombs of these first dynasty kings, there's also burials of other people. You can see the first one, the earliest one, King Aha, they're all separate. Later ones, they're kind of in these big trenches that are divided.
Hmm.
And we also have these subsidiary burials around the funerary enclosures as well. And so the image that you're looking at here from one of the subsidiary burials from around one of the funerary enclosures that was excavated one of the years while I was working there. So this was excavated in about 2004,
Okay.
2005. So more recently. So this is one of the burials from around the funerary enclosures. But most of the ones around the tombs were excavated like by Petrie in the 1900s. So we only have so much information from them. We don't necessarily have all of the bodies in order to look and try to figure out how they were killed. But some people say, like, okay, we have all these tombs in a long trench. It looks like they were all built at one time. Maybe they were all filled at one time. So maybe these, if you have a bunch of people dying at one time, maybe that's human sacrifice.
Aha.
But other people say, we don't have any direct evidence for this. Like there's not a lot of evidence on the bodies that we do have. We don't have the roof intact in most cases. So like we can't really see were they roofed in one go or not. So it kind of remains an open question. But there's certainly people that want to be buried around these tombs.
Hmm.
And an interesting thing is the composition of who is buried there is different. They're not all the same. So in some cases, it's like a lot of young men. In some cases, there's women and children. Like it really varies. And like I said, we don't have all of them. But what you do have from some of these smaller stelae with the names of the people who were buried there. And in some cases, we can tell that a lot of them were women because they have the hieroglyphic symbol for a woman.
Hmm.
So that's a bit of the evidence of who was buried there.
Cool.
Yeah.
No more human remains.
Yeah. But there are also some animals. So
Aha.
we also have some burials of animals from Abydos. So Hierakonpolis wasn't alone. They did carry this tradition into a little bit into the first dynasty.
Hmm.
So the tomb of the first, debatably the first ruler of the first dynasty is Aha. And at the very end tomb, so we think that these big three main tombs were his tomb and main chambers, and then we have subsidiary tombs of humans, and then this last one, they found like 7 lions inside of it.
Wow.
So you have your lions at the end there with these tombs.
A lot of lions.
What's that? Yeah. I mean, if nothing else, there weren't a lot of lions still roaming around in Egypt at this time period. So they
Yeah, of course
definitely
not.
had to go through a lot of effort to get those and bring them certainly a status and display of power, if nothing else. But
Oh yeah.
actually also could have other like meanings of like protection or be associated with gods, anything like that. And then down in the funerary enclosures, we had one tomb that had 3 donkeys in it. I
Hmm.
believe it was 3. You see 2 of them here. And so these are some early remains of donkeys. I do think they were domesticated. Ancient Egyptians were domesticating donkeys over this time period.
Hmm.
And they were the real pack animal. They facilitated a lot of the trade and exchange of this time period. Camels didn't come into Egypt until much later. It was donkeys.
Yeah, donkeys are like like a cheap automobile of the ancient world. Everybody
Exactly.
had it. Everybody had one and they did everything.
That was the way it got around. So we do have a few subsidiary burials associated with these early First Dynasty tombs.
Cool.
And then we have one more kind of weird burial out here, and that is burial of boats.
Yes.
So yeah, going back to this picture, you could see right here between Casa Kemwe's enclosure and this one that they think is probably associated with King Den, there's burials of a whole bunch of boats. Here, they did open up the ends of a few of these and look inside to find some of the wooden remains. The boats were kind of buried and then surrounded with mud brick that was then plastered over white. And here you can see me excavating the ends of one of these, looking at the relationship between the enclosure wall of Casa Kemwe and the boat itself.
Very cool.
We think it's more likely they're associated with the tomb of Den, and they were already there when Casa Kemwe built his. But again, I think more excavation and more dating of the remains would be helpful in this case to really understand what's going on with these boats.
Okay.
All right, so to take a breath, that's a lot of stuff. So now we've seen two whole enclosures from different time periods that have like a lot of these components of royal burial complexes. There's still so much more to go. I got the first pyramid complex and then a quicker overview of pyramids between this one and Giza before getting to a couple of the Giza ones.
So now we move on to the first pyramids, is what you're saying.
Yes, now
Everybody
we're
get
moving
excited.
to pyramids. Yeah, finally we get to pyramids.
So this is what? So we're talking that dynasty one up until the first pyramid. We're talking like 300-400 years.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, the dating is, being refined a bit, but it's a couple hundred years for sure to
Okay.
go from the first one to the first royal burial at Abydos to the first pyramid complex.
Okay, that makes sense.
So after that big mud brick structure of Casa Kemwes that we saw, the next king is King Djoser, and he moved everything up to Saqqara. So this is closer to Cairo and closer to Giza. It's not far from Giza in the scheme of things, and would have been close to the ancient city of Memphis, where a lot of the political life had moved to. So here you can really see that all of these royal tomb complexes are on the west side of the Nile.
Mm-hmm.
And I did take this map from a very recent article that is slightly controversial. So, but it is looking at.
Is this the one that was just published on the different waterways? Yeah, okay.
Yes, it is. It's not controversial in the fact that we have evidence that there was a branch of the Nile that was a lot closer to the pyramids. It's just controversial in the fact that, like, we've known about this for a while. They just looked at another source of evidence confirming that this branch was there.
Yeah, in fact, we talked about some of this in an earlier video I did on the archaeology of the Sphinx, when we talked about how there were different branches of the Niles that help move these stones along. So this is a well-known thing by environmental archaeologists and Egyptologists and geologists. We've known this for a while, yeah.
Exactly. But it was a convenient map that showed you the location of a lot of these pyramids and royal burial complexes up closer to Giza.
And also, I guess, this is probably not the fault of the authors of this article. It's the fault of the news for announcing it kind of as something brand new, right? Or am I wrong that the authors were trying to do that?
I think when you look at the article, they don't necessarily acknowledge all of the work previously, but I think they are just adding, they're adding more evidence and using a different source. They did a lot of coring and things like this to it. So
okay, yeah.
It's partly the news, but like they could have acknowledged some of the other work.
Yeah,
as far as
fair enough. Okay.
But it does really show us all of these were on the west side of the Nile, and it kind of shows you the relationship of a bunch of these pyramid complexes that are up closer to Giza.
Mm-hmm.
And so the first one built up here was the Saqqara pyramid complex. And here's just the Google Earth of it. You can see it's right there. Here is kind of a map of what it looked like.
Mm-hmm.
And so before, where we had that funerary enclosure down by the settlement, and then we had the burial out in the desert, Djoser took these and combined them into one.
Okay.
And so I took pains to point out that niched facade of the funerary enclosure, because you can really see that he has this huge enclosure. This is like a kilometer long at least.
Wow.
It's very large, and it has this niching all around it. And they've reconstructed and built it up in the area around the entranceway. And it actually has those same orientations. So this entranceway is in the southeast corner, local southeast. but yet there's still like a lot of stuff going on in the north-south axis of this. So the whole axis is oriented north-south, and then it has this entryway in the southeast here.
Hmm.
So this one, we don't really see a processional route. We don't see a causeway like we see later, because he took these two components that were far apart and he combined them together. And then the other thing he did, very innovative, besides doing that, is instead of building in mud brick, he started building in stone.
Huh.
So you can see this is all built in limestone there. So this is monumental structure built in stone this time for the first time. So not only was he building a pyramid, he was building on a larger scale, and he was building out of stone.
Yeah, so it's like a new world.
Yeah, he just
But
took
based
things to
on
the
all
next
these
level.
components of the earlier world, you know.
Yes.
Yeah.
Here you can finally see the step pyramid itself. But before getting into that, I wanted to talk about, so it did retain multiple different areas for ritual activities in here. So he's still, except in this case, in it, we actually see these kind of semicircular shapes, boundary markers. There's some of them built in here. And so I put an overhead view so you can really see what they looked like from overhead. And then here's the image from that label I was showing you of, in this case, there's three of those, and the king like running in between them.
Huh.
So it gives us kind of some idea of some of the activities that might have been taking place in this big open courtyard here.
So the king would run around.
Yes, and this is likely like a periodic renewal that you show that you're still a vigorous king, and you can still.
Yeah.
So we call them boundary stones. Like, is he like running around like a symbol of, you know, all of his lands?
Huh.
And then over here on this side, there's these like, they're really like dummy chapels. Like, it's another courtyard, and it has these like stone chapels in the shape of contemporary temples of different kinds, but they're mostly solid. There's like only like a tiny little entrance. You can go in a little bit, but they're mostly solid. So they're really for like maybe the king's soul to use rather than people.
Hmm.
Um, but they give us another insight into some of these components of the complex and activities going on with it. And then over on the north side, we also have a lot going on. So he has a temple on the north side of the pyramid there, and hopefully you can see that. And then next to it is another court, and inside that court, there's this thing called the serdab. And so what that is it's a little room that would have been closed off where you would have put a statue of the tomb owner. So looking from above, this is a statue of King Djoser, and it would have been roofed. So his soul can come up into the serdab statue and receive offerings. And then you have the court in front of that for offerings.
Okay.
And I also showed this because it's an example of like two temples next to each other, which is something we see later in Khafre's complex. And then this north-south orientation, this temple is on the north side, and the entrance to the tomb itself is on the north side.
Mm-hmm.
But before getting to that, so here we have a statue of the king again. So in that, this is the actual statue that was in that serdab. So this one is in the Cairo Museum, and this is the actual statue, and they have a replica out in the serdab today so that, you know, it's not exposed to the elements.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And he looks very broody because his inlaid eyes are unfortunately missing. I think he would look a little less daunting.
If you have bright eyes, bright stones in there, yeah.
Yeah. Probably like quartz and obsidian potentially. And then here's another image of the king, and again you see him, those little boundary markers, and here you can more clearly see that it's the king with his headdress, and he's running and he's holding his scepters, and he's running around these little semicircles. And this
Yeah.
is from one of the burial areas.
So they like to run laps.
He liked to show that he was a vigorous ruler. All right. So then the pyramid itself, first pyramid that we have in Egypt, wasn't originally planned as a pyramid. It was planned like one of those mastabas. So mastaba in Arabic means bench,
Hmm.
basically means a rectangle. And like some of those earlier ones I showed you with the hidden mounds, that was kind of the tomb type that other elite people built in this time period and before, these like rectangular tombs. By looking at what they can see of the inside masonry and everything, you can see that it went through a couple of construction phases. They built a mastaba and extended it a few times, and then they were like, hey, let's stack these up together. And there were actually two phases even of the stack step pyramid component.
Hmm.
So we can see multiple construction phases and change plans. So like experimentation, trial and error going on in the creation of the first pyramid.
Do you by any chance have a photo we could use that shows the different architectural phasing in situ?
No, I sorry, I didn't grab one
Okay,
of those,
no worries.
but I do have some more photos of the inside and the burial components. So Djoser had a very elaborate burial component. So the previous ones we saw in Hierakonpolis, it was just, you know, sometimes even just a simple pit and then mud lined. And then in the first dynasty, they had some different chambers. And he's got like a whole series of galleries going on here. They think part of them are kind of like mimicking like a house or an apartment with different areas. And I didn't have time to get into it, but we can also see the idea of tomb as house in earlier tombs in Abydos,
Hmm.
where they have little like fake doors in between the different rooms and everything. So there's some continuity there. But these were decorated, so they had these beautiful inlaid tiles that mimic reed matting that would have gone and on the walls in buildings. And then this one, this kind of roundish bit here, is a doorway. So they would like roll up a reed mat, and that is your door. And
Hmm.
so it's a kind of built imitating things in softer materials like reed and mud brick in stone. He's doing this throughout the complex.
Very cool.
And then I also wanted to point out the granite component. So his actual burial chamber is granite. So what you're looking at here are granite stones forming his actual burial vaults that at the bottom of this large passage there.
Okay.
And then there's all sorts of storage chambers associated with this complex, and these were full of all kinds of items. I just pulled out a couple here. On the right, you see these lions. This is carved out of alabaster or calcite, and it's kind of like a libation table, but I figured I'd demonstrate that there's some lion symbolism still going on here.
A lot of lions.
Yep. And then on the left, you see these huge calcite vases. But in all of his burial chambers, they found like 40,000 stone vessels
Wow.
in here. And not all out of calcite, which is really soft stone, but they're made of all kinds of stones, hard stones, diorite, gneiss, all kinds of things like that, porphyry. So just tens of thousands. They think probably he had either in building his complex, maybe he disturbed some earlier tombs and like reused some of the things in those tombs,
Aha.
or like maybe he had like gathered from earlier kings' tombs to protect, they had broken into protect them. I'm not sure, but he had a lot of stone vessels in his burial.
Interesting. Yeah, I mean, I just talked with Eric Klein earlier, and at the start of his
Hmm.
book, he talks about tomb robbing in ancient Egypt and protecting the pharaoh's bodies. So they bring them from one tomb to another to protect them from robbers. And so this is one of the reasons why the pharaohs and the occupants of tombs are a little muddled because
Yeah.
of robbery and because of people trying to protect them. I guess in this case, maybe even hoarding earlier stuff, maybe as an
Yeah,
act of protection or not. Yeah.
reburying it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the archaeologists of the past 100 years or so are not the first one. Like, I mean, especially with these large monuments you can see on the ground, there's periods of reuse and robbery and re-excavation and reburial, and there's like just thousands of years of history going into these things,
Yeah.
developing what we actually find today.
And the punishment for tomb robbery in the New Kingdom was death. So, you don't want to do it.
No, yeah, they were serious about it. It wasn't a good idea.
Yeah.
But if you were the king, maybe it's a different story.
If you're the king building the first pyramid, you can do whatever you want.
You're reinterring,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, exactly.
So yeah, so that is Djoser. So the last component to get to here, he didn't have subsidiary burials of like humans, animals, and boats like we saw, but he has this new thing called a satellite tomb.
Hmm.
So over on the south side, he has kind of like a mini version of his like underground burial complex built over on the south side of his complex. And the reason we don't think he has actual burial chamber component is really small. Like it's too small to really fit a person.
Hmm.
So maybe it was for a statue, maybe it was for the king's internal organs. There's a lot of different potential thoughts and theories about what this could be. Another one is like maybe it's a nod to the tombs in Abydos in the south.
Okay.
Because as we'll see, these satellite tombs are always on the south side of the complex. So maybe he's acknowledging those that he moved to the north from those royal burials of the first kings and putting like a kind of cenotaph there, nodding to the south.
They're facing Osiris.
Yep. So we see these continuing and we see them always in the south. And they don't seem to be associated with human burials. There's not space for them, but there's some kind of additional subsidiary feature to these complexes. All right, and that's Djoser. That's the first pyramid.
And then they
So,
don't stop.
yeah, so we're getting closer. So between that first pyramid and the Giza pyramid, there are 5 more pyramids that were either built or attempted to be built before we get to Giza. So not only do we have this longer history at other sites, but we have like a longer history of pyramid building even before you get to Giza. So after Djoser completed the step pyramid, the next 2 were attempts of other step pyramids that were started but weren't completed. So King Sekhemhet at Saqqara started one, and then another ruler, possibly Kaba, at another site in the area, Zawayat al-Iran, also started another step pyramid there. And you can see these were probably one right after the other. They have very similar substructure layouts. And hopefully you could see from my list here is that they don't include all of these components. Possibly because they weren't finished.
Mm-hmm.
So like we have an enclosure wall at Sekhemhet, but we don't have an enclosure wall at Zawayat al-Iran. We're not sure about the kind of temple components of these. They definitely have the burial chambers. And Sekhemhet at Saqqara does have that satellite tomb. You can see it here, but probably not some of the other components. There were some animal remains found inside the burial, but I don't know if that's necessarily the same idea. There were gazelles, rams, and cattle found inside the substructure, but maybe not the same as the animal subsidiary burials.
Mm-hmm.
So we have some pyramids that were started but not completed. So again, it's just the point is the Egyptians weren't just like suddenly nailing building pyramids perfectly out of nowhere. Like you can see this trial and error in this development.
Oh yeah. It's not that easy to build a pyramid.
Yeah, exactly.
At least a big one.
Yeah, exactly. Certainly not just the Giza ones. So then next you get King Sneferu, and he builds the first straight-sided pyramid. I put sort of there, and I'll tell you why in a minute. So this is a pyramid at Meidum. It's way down here at the bottom of this map. So you can see Saqqara was up here, and then he moves way down here farther to the south for the Meidum pyramid. And you can see it in the Google Maps view there. And so this one has a lot of those components. It has a causeway built in. So this is kind of this formalized connection between the part out in the desert and the part closer, at least, to the settlements. In this one, you can see is oriented east-west, at least in terms of there's a small chapel on the east side of the pyramid. The causeway is oriented east-west. So it's again, and then east of this is the Nile. So hopefully you can see that here. So has that orientation towards the Nile. Although I'll say the actual tomb chamber is still entered from the north. So you have these components of north, south, and east-west orientations.
Okay.
So he has an enclosure wall going around the pyramid and around some of the components associated with the complex. One of those complexes is a really small chapel on the east side. It's not as elaborate as some of the more later temples, but interestingly, there was no valley temple at the end of this causeway. It just kind of ends there. So don't know what's going on there. In terms of this superstructure itself, you can see in this image here, it looks stepped, right? So it was originally built as another stepped pyramid. But basically what happened is he then later goes on to build 2 more pyramids and with straight sides, and he figures out the straight-sided pyramids thing, and then he comes back and he makes this a straight-sided pyramid. And then those outer casings fall off and get robbed. So now we see the stepped inner structure again. So what you're looking at is stepped. It was originally conceived as stepped, but then he later comes back and finishes it with straight sides. It has a much more simplified burial component compared to Djoser. So you can see it here in this lower image. You've got the entranceway from the north, a little bit of room for maneuvering there, and then one kind of vaulted chamber inside.
Okay. And
then again, we don't see the subsidiary burials, but we do have a satellite pyramid in this. So same idea without like an actual burial below it. And you can see it's on the south side again. There weren't any images of Sneferu associated with this that we know of, but there were 2 stelae associated with this chapel on the east side, but they were blank. So maybe they just never finished. So kind of like how we saw Merit Neith had 2 stelae out at her tomb, he also has 2 stelae out here.
So wait, Sneferu had multiple pyramids, but was he buried in this one or no?
We don't think he was buried in this one. So we think he started this pyramid. And then for whatever reason, from here, he moves up to a new site called Dashur, where he completes 2 other pyramids before coming back and putting the straight sides on this pyramid. But we don't think it was his actual final resting place. So that might account for some of the components, like not having the valley temple or not having the stele finished. But he got pretty far along with it.
Yeah, seriously.
He was actually the greatest builder of all of the Old Kingdom kings who were building. So in terms of like volume and how much he actually built, it's more than the Great Pyramid. He just did over 3 of them. But part of the reason we think that this one was built by Sneferu is because like the ancient name for this area was Jed Sneferu, which means Sneferu endures. And then they've also found other texts in the area with his name on it and everything. So at least the ancient Egyptians associated this area with him.
Okay.
All right. So that is Sneferu, but he was not done. So he at some point decides to move up to a site called Dashur that you see here. And this is closer to Saqqara, again on the west side of the Nile. And in this Google Earth map, you can see there's 2 pyramids here that we're going to look at, the Bent Pyramid and the Red Pyramid. He builds both of these at this site. The Bent Pyramid was the next one that he did. And you can see why it's called the Bent Pyramid, because it has one angle and it changes. He has a causeway associated with this, which is, what I'm associating with the earlier processional roads. You can see on this map, it's oriented east-west-ish, though the causeway goes kind of from the north side of his pyramid over to the east, which is towards the Nile Valley and the Nile. He has an enclosure wall going around the pyramid and the satellite pyramid. The headline about this one is the construction phases and the trial and error and the fact that this doesn't end up as like a perfect pyramid. So again, from looking at what they can see of the inside of this, it looks like he started a smaller pyramid with a pretty steep angle of the sides. So this is the first one where he's building it with the idea of getting a straight-sided pyramid from the beginning.
Hmm.
And he builds it with like a 60-degree angle, but apparently wasn't working very well because then they go back and they widen it, like they build more around it to try to hold it in place. So
Huh.
so they kind of girdle it. The interesting thing is these early step pyramids and this pyramid, they weren't built how you and I think of building pyramids and like, let's lay a row and then let's lay another row on top of it. They were built by doing like angled leaning layers and then building them out like that.
Huh. So you start on
Huh.
the inside and then you work your way out.
You start and you build these kind of angled layers, yeah. And I know they don't go all the way up because at some point, so he's building these angled layers at this 60-degree angle, and it's still not working. So they change how they're building it and they build the flat layers. So at some point in the middle of this, they're like, okay, let's try something else. And they start building flat layers like we think of leg bricks. And then after doing that for a bit, is when they finally change that angle to a lower angle of 44 degrees, which is closer to what like Giza is. And that's the angle of the top that you see there. And they're able to actually like complete the pyramid and achieve it. And obviously it's still standing today. So, it did stay up.
It's just a
But
little wonky. It's okay.
yeah, it's just a little bit wonky. But another problem with this pyramid is they just built it directly on the desert gravel. Like they didn't dig down to bedrock. They didn't build like a limestone solid footing for it to stay on. And so we think as well as like the angle and these different construction phases and different construction methods, I think it wasn't that stable. And actually inside, I was looking all around to find like a reliable picture, which like I didn't necessarily find, but in some of those, so you can see the image of the interior burial structure there. They have actually ancient wood shoring up those rooms because they
Huh.
were worried that they were going to collapse in.
And so in many ways, what we're seeing is not just this gradual development, but we're seeing the trial and error even sort of in situ of,
Exactly.
building a mastaba, expanding it until it becomes a step pyramid, and then going from step pyramid to straight sided in two different ways really here until you get
Yeah,
to the next one.
exactly. And in this one, you really like you can't miss the trial and error. Like
Yeah.
they changed the angle of it. And this is the first one conceived of with that straight side. And they didn't really get it right, like on the first try, which
Yeah.
I think is great to acknowledge and shows how they're learning from the experience of doing all of this.
Yeah.
And also another element of this one is like the interior blocks, they weren't laid all perfectly. They're just kind of thrown in and there's big gaps and they filled them with limestone debris, like not even a real mortar. So like all of this is contributing to just some of the problems and like kind of lack of confidence of this one. And
Yeah.
actually for years you couldn't go inside it as like a tourist. Although apparently they've checked it out and shored it up because now you can go inside. So
Huh.
this is one of the ones I haven't been in and I'd like to visit in a future just to go check it out. But probably the scariest one once you know all the stuff that's going on inside it.
Yeah, especially the lack of foundations and everything. I mean, geez.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. Even in the Great Pyramid, which like, okay, this has been here for 4,500 years. It's not going to fall on me today. Like you get a little worried when you go inside it.
I mean, this one's been here even longer, so that should give you more reason to
True.
trust it, right?
Exactly. True. It has been here longer. It's staying up there. And one thing I haven't mentioned yet, but it stands out on this one, you can see how the outside of the pyramid was covered with these casing blocks. So you can see those, and they chose finer, like better quality limestone for the outer portion than the inner portion to make it smooth. And it would have been like kind of a white limestone. It's been there
Yeah.
for 4,500 years, so it's not bright, shiny white right now. But yeah, but all this fine white limestone casing. And that's the part that they, really finished very nicely and smoothed it down and carved it and did all that.
Yeah, I mean, we're just seeing so often the ruined core rather than how it would have appeared. Like we
Mhm.
saw with the Shuna, that large complex at Abydos, where you
Right.
dig down and you can still see that hatching in it or whatever, the design of it, but you can't
Yep.
see it above ground. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So that's another similarity and shared component of these complexes is that white finish. So
Yeah.
we had the white plaster on the Shuna, and here we have like the white limestone finish on these.
Yeah, and it's also why
So
we often rebury stuff after we excavate it so that we can preserve it for future people. Because
yeah,
exposing it to the elements is what causes the damage. Yeah.
definitely. Yeah. The sand in Egypt is great for preservation, which is why we have so much great evidence from
Yeah,
there.
exactly.
Nice and dry. So at this one, we have that satellite pyramid again on the south. It does have a small interior chamber, but again, too small for a human burial. And we don't have subsidiary graves, human, animal, or boat, but there are surrounding cemeteries for high officials and other people to be buried close in the area.
Okay.
And that's a feature that it actually carries through all of these as well. Also wanted to show you a little bit of the images of the king. So this image was from his valley temple. I don't know if I said that, but he did have a valley temple associated with this pyramid. You can see it here. And there were some statues of the king found in that valley temple. In this pyramid, there was also a small chapel on the east side. And here you go. You can see it in this one. And that would have had two stela in it as well. And just the bases of those are preserved. And so here you can see us just kind of dorking around, having a good time there. But that's the remains of that small chapel on the east side of the bent pyramid.
Okay.
All right. So then, but he was not done. Made him the bent pyramid, and he's like, I want to get this right. So finally, he nails pyramid building with the red pyramid, also known as the North Pyramid, into shore. So you can see here's the bent pyramid to the south and the red pyramid to the north. So this one, it does have a valley temple. It does have a small chapel attached to the pyramid on the east side, but no causeway built in between.
Hmm.
Don't know if he just didn't get to it. He'd already built a lot of things by this point. Maybe he just ran out of time. But it didn't have that component. Here you have a really clear east-west orientation, like chapel on the east side, valley temple to the east, straight down the way. He has both of those multiple areas for ritual activities, one adjacent, one in the valley. He had 3 chambers inside, so they had that same like vaulted shape as we saw in his two earlier pyramids. But there were 3 chambers. 2 of them were below the ground level, and one he built up inside the superstructure, which is something we see with the Great Pyramid. Interestingly enough, there's no satellite pyramid in this one, but he already built 2 whole giant full-size pyramids. So maybe he just didn't feel like he needed a satellite pyramid. And actually the bent pyramid is to the south of this pyramid itself. So you can see he has like a lot of these components, but not all of these components. But he does like finally manage to get the straight-sided pyramid. And they do think that this is where he was most likely buried of the 3 of those.
Okay. That makes sense. It's a nice pyramid. I've always found this one, I've never been to this one, but I've always found the photos of this one are just sort of, it looks like a nice pyramid. Something
Yeah.
about its shape, its landscape, it looks nice.
Like it is great to go visit the Red Pyramid and the Bent Pyramid because most people, tourists, people visiting Egypt, everybody goes to Giza. A lot of people make it to Saqqara. Almost nobody makes it down here to the shore to see the Red Pyramid and the Bent Pyramid. So you can pretty much get a pyramid to yourself.
Huh.
And you go down there, there's not a lot of people. It's really just a great experience to go out here and see these. And you can go inside both of them.
Okay. Very cool.
All right, so now after all of this, we finally get to Giza. And, I kind of hope you're tired. Like, I hope you're tired of this. I hope you're sick of causeways and enclosures and temples and satellite pyramids. Because, my goal was to impress on you just how much has come before we get to Giza. And, how much these complexes, they all have a variety of elements. They're all similar. No 2 of them are exactly the same.
Mhm.
So, yeah. Are you tired, Floyd?
I am exhausted. I've already decided I'm done with archaeology in Egypt forever.
That's it. That's enough. But yes, so we've got 1,000 years of royal burial complexes before we get to Giza. So just to wrap it up, we could take a quick look at Khufu and Khafre, and then just to round out what those
Just to
complexes
show
look
how
like.
they relate to these earlier things. Yeah,
Yeah, to
that makes
everything
sense.
shown you there. So finally, we move up to Giza, way up here at the top of this map, of course, on the west side of the Nile. And of course, you can see these from your Google Earth or even Google Maps photos. And part of the reason that they might have moved up here and chosen this site is that they learned from the experience of building that bent pyramid and the red pyramid. And Giza has good limestone bedrock close to the surface.
Good
So
rock.
it provides both a base to build the pyramids on that is stable, and it provides a stone for building the pyramids.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly. I mean,
yeah.
so one of the points we were making when talking about the geoarchaeology of the Sphinx in this earlier video was that exact point that the quarry is right there. And so
Mhm.
archaeologists have been able to trace out the quarrying of rock on the plateau and in order to build the pyramids itself, and the Sphinx is located right in one of these quarries, right? And so,
Yes,
yeah.
exactly. That's exactly it. I'm sorry. Oh, dang, this reconstruction doesn't show up very well, but this whole central area here is actually lower down than the rest. And,
Yeah.
you know, nobody realized at first because it was filled with all of this limestone debris and desert debris. And then you excavate that down and you get to the tombs that were built when it was open and freestanding after they'd quarried all the material they were out. And like, yeah, it's a huge depression. So most of the stone for the pyramids, they just took next to it and piled it up.
Yeah.
Um, Conveniently right there. But they also did level the ground. So
Hmm.
they dug down. There's a slight slope in that area. So in the western end, which I think is the higher end, they dug it down a little flatter, and then they built up the eastern part so that you'd have flat level bases to build your pyramids on. You have like a good solid base. So that helps why they preserve to this day and are such
Hmm.
good ones. Nice reconstruction for you, a little bit more exciting maybe than the Google Maps version. And then just another map of kind of how these relate together that we can refer back if we need to.
Hmm.
But so Khufu moved to Giza and he built the biggest pyramid, and he had almost all of these elements of a royal burial complex here. So he had a causeway that went down. You can see it up here in this one. That went down from the pyramid to the valley area. There's little of it that survives now, but they have found a little bit of relief carving. So it might have been built up with walls that had relief carving on it. He had a mortuary temple next to the pyramid that was a lot more elaborate than its predecessors. You know, the one I showed you where I was standing in front of it is just like a few small areas, but it had a basalt paving, it had granite columns, like it was a full like temple there. In this case, he has the enclosure wall around the pyramid, so he has that component. Um, and he definitely had subsidiary burials in this case. So he built three smaller pyramids on the side. They were the Queen's pyramids. They likely did have burials below them. And we found some artifacts in a shaft near one of these that relate to one of the queens. So they think maybe those were reburied there from inside one of these tombs. Um,
Huh.
and then he has a satellite pyramid as well, and not just these queens' tombs. It's and it has like a tiny little chamber, but again, not big enough for an actual burial. So he has both the subsidiary pyramids and the satellite pyramids. And then he brings the boats back. So
Uh-huh.
he has these boat burials here. I'll show you pictures of those in a second. So we've got the boat burials around those. And then he did have a valley temple, but that is mostly under like modern Cairo habitation. So they found the paving area of his valley temple, the basalt pavement, but we don't have the actual remains. Like that was probably torn down and built over ages and ages and ages ago, anciently. And so part of that, I don't know if you've seen, but a lot of the images that we have of the kings come from these valley temples, actually.
Hmm.
So
Hmm.
without his valley temple, And so we actually only have one statue of Khufu, and it is this big. So I tried to, this from recent trip to Cairo Museum. It's right here. So every time I look at it, I can't help thinking of the original Aladdin movie and the genie. Phenomenal giant pyramid. Tiny step.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
yeah,
Biggest pyramid out there,
it's
tiniest
true.
statue of him. Yeah.
And actually, this isn't even from Giza. This was found at Abydos. So
Yeah.
you can tell he was going down there doing stuff at Abydos. It was still very much an important site in this time period. And like I showed this image of one of Khafre's statues, which is full life size, kind of looming in the background there over him. So he built this great pyramid, but statuary we don't have a lot. Here's some of the boat burials. So they actually found the full boats in these boat pits that were around the sides of the pyramids, and they reconstructed this one. You could see this is just a huge boat, the original wood. They did this huge reconstruction project. There's another one being excavated now that's not in as good condition, but there's a huge conservation project where they're excavating and conserving that one.
Very cool.
It used to be in a building on the side of the pyramid, but I believe that they have torn that down, and I think they're moving this to the new Grand Egyptian Museum that is being built.
Okay.
So
Yeah, I saw it next to the pyramid, but yeah.
yeah, this is where it was when I saw this, when I took this one. I think I didn't say anything about the burial itself, but again, like the other ones, like since Djoser, we haven't seen huge, like elaborate burial complexes, but he's got 3 chambers here. This one is inside the pyramid. So the last pyramid that Sneferu built for him had 1 chamber up inside the actual superstructure. He has 2 up inside the superstructure and 1 below. And I'm sure there's a lot of other stuff that has been written and can be said about these, but I'm just talking about the components in general here.
Yeah, and
So
just a note to everybody, we do not find any fully intact mummies from pyramids, but there are sarcophagi, for example, where
mhm.
these individuals were buried. As we've talked about, pharaohs were moved to protect them from grave robbers, and many pyramids actually have human remains, like pieces of mummies that were not looted away. And so we are very sure that these are tombs.
And some of the later pyramids, so they don't stop building pyramids after Giza. They keep building pyramids.
Yeah.
And then the Fifth Dynasty pyramids have like texts, elaborate texts inside them that talk about the king and the afterlife and all of this. So like
They tell us the whole
they're,
sort of theology behind it. In
they're
fact, that's one of the cool things about ancient, Egyptology is they tell us why they're doing this. They tell us who did it, who designed these in many cases.
yeah,
Yeah.
we have some texts to help us out here. And one of the greatest finds, if we're speaking of texts, is not that long ago, 10, 15 years ago, they found papyrus
Hmm.
of a ship captain, Merer, who was in charge of ferrying the limestone from the Tura limestone quarries over to Giza in the Fourth Dynasty. So we
Yeah.
have written evidence talking about them, and that would have been just for those fine outer casing stones. Like I said, the bulk of the limestone came from directly outer casing to give it a really nice finish. And so that is what he and his crew were ferrying by boat from the other side of the river.
Yeah. So they're bringing the sort of outer casing, better quality limestone, I guess, and they're
Mhm.
using a boat probably similar to the one that we've excavated, or probably.
Honestly, yeah, I mean, there's all different kinds of boat styles. I'm not exactly, I don't know all the details, but and I wish I had a person to scale here, but you can see the walkway and like the fire hydrant thing for scale.
Yeah.
Like these were very good big size boats. You could stack
Hmm.
some rocks on top of these. So yeah, so that is Khufu and his Great Pyramid. But then actually the next king didn't even stay at Giza. So when you think about like the planning of Giza and like all of this elaborate stuff, like the next king didn't even go to build his tomb there. The next king was Jedefre, and he went over to Abu Rawash and at least started a pyramid there. And I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this one. It has a lot of similar elements. They're not sure if this one is finished or not, because we only have so much remains right now. This site's about 8 kilometers away. You can see it has boat pit, satellite pyramid, mortuary temple, causeway. But so taller the pyramid, built at another site in between. And then finally, we get to Khafre, who decides to come back to Giza and build his pyramid and the Sphinx that we know here. And so while this pyramid is actually technically slightly smaller than the Great Pyramid, he built it on slightly higher ground so that it looks taller, or at least as tall. So very clever there. They get smarter with every pyramid, it seems like. You can see it has a general east-west orientation, though the temples and the causeway don't line up directly east-west. They're kind of like off-center there. There was an enclosure wall around just the pyramid itself, but that isn't, none of that's left today, but you can see the foundations of where the cut into the bedrock where the enclosure wall would have gone. And that enclosure wall would have created like a kind of 10-meter wide like corridor or courtyard around it. And you can even see they built in slope and like drainage so that the rainwater could drain out of that and not get built up inside that. And then of course, again, this is a true pyramid. And in this case, Khafre didn't spend the time building the interior chambers inside the pyramid. He did kind of just one chamber underground, still entered from the north though. So we still see that north entranceway being important, but then the east-west orientation of the pyramid itself. Only one main chamber. There's a black granite sarcophagus in there. So then he had directly adjacent to the pyramid, he had his mortuary temple. So here's an aerial view of kind of what it looks like now, along with the plan and a 3D digital kind of reconstruction. So this was on the east side of the pyramid. You can see it's a lot bigger and a lot more elaborate than previous ones. This was built with some huge limestone blocks. Like I think they estimate that were like moved into place. Some of them estimating like 200 tons or something.
Wow.
So humongous limestone blocks. And that's actually all three of these temples were built with these just enormous limestone blocks forming the basis of all three of them. And then it was kind of faced with the granite, and at least in like parts of the lower course of this one. And then it had granite columns in it. There probably would have been statues of the king in this one, because we see the sockets where the statue base would have gone. If you think back to that Khafre no, I haven't showed you the Khafre statue
Not yet.
We'll see on the Khafre statue, they have these large square bases for setting them in place. And then we can see kind of where they would have sat. From there, you had eastish towards the Nile, down the valley, down the causeway, and you get to the Valley Temple. So like I said, also made of those giant blocks with the granite facing. This one of different building phases, which caused it to end up being not perfectly square, but you can see in plan here, it's a little trapezoid type. And then the Sphinx temple next to it, you can see follows that same shape of being not perfectly square. And also is built with enormous limestone blocks forming the base of it. And then you have the granite facing. And it also had emplacements for statues of the kings there. I think it's a whole nother talk to go into the evidence for, how these were kind of created together. But just to look at one thing they look at is the patterning of the limestone, because it's not just like one solid sheet. The limestone has natural variations in the layers. So that's what you're looking at over here on the right. And then you can see so it's kind of easy to match up, like, oh, you can see there's this like yellow band of like softer stone with harder stone above it and below it. And then you can match that up with where it came from in the existing limestone that's still in place on the plateau.
So in a sense, sourcing where stones came from. Yeah.
Yes, sourcing where stones came from. And so looking at that, the limestone used to build the Valley Temple comes from the upper layers. So that would have to have been built first. And then the stone used for the Sphinx temple comes from the lower layers. So that would have had to have been built second. You can go to the ERA website to look at more of the evidence. They've got great maps laying out the different kinds of limestone and where it comes from and where it ends up in the temples and all of that. And you can see in this image some of that like sandwiching that's like part of what they're looking at to understand like, okay, this stone must have come from over here and all of that.
Mhm.
So inside these temples, you had the images of the ruler of the king. So here's a great famous statue of Khafre. So this was actually found along with 6 other statues in his valley temple in a hole in the floor. So they'd been moved there and kind of deposited there. And that happens in a lot of temples in Egypt later when they were done with statues. These are really like important objects. You can't just toss them out in the trash. So the temple's already like a sacred special place. So they would open up a hole in the floor and kind of bury them and inter them there. And that is actually why we get so many statues from ancient Egypt, because many of them were deposited that way. And you
Mhm.
can see this is made of diorite. It's just absolutely amazing. And then also we have the Sphinx as well.
That's
Uh,
less impressive.
quite impressive, very different, but we've got like multiple images. And I think he did not, one thing about Khafre is he was not shy about the statues of himself. So there are like 50 or 60 emplacements for statues that were probably of him. So like we found
Huh.
7 of these statues, but if you count all the emplacements in the 3 different temples, it's over 50. So he probably originally had 50 images of himself plus the Sphinx.
Dude was
So
vain.
you can
Yeah.
something here, but like that whole idea of putting his face on this Sphinx on this thing, you can see how that fits with his like, I want
Yeah.
to have a lot of statues separate there.
And the Sphinx had
Um,
a beard. It was been excavated, so we have the
yeah,
beard. Yeah.
yes, it had the beard. It's not attached to it anymore. Um, and so then he also had the boat pits. So there's boat pits around near his mortuary temple, the one close to the pyramid. And he did not have the subsidiary pyramids for queens like we saw with Khufu. But he did have his satellite pyramid, although they label it subsidiary pyramid here. But it's that idea of that pyramid with no burial below it on the south side of the pyramid, the smaller one. And then he didn't have any animal burials, but he did, of course, have the Sphinx, so like a giant lion there. So he has that kind of protection of animals associated there. And yeah, so I mean, I hope that's what I have for you. And I hope you
Wow.
can see from all of that that we have these royal burial complexes. They're full complexes with a lot of different components. None of them are exactly the same, but they draw on a lot of the same elements, and each king kind of combines them in his own way to form these. And they have a history of over 1,000 years
Yeah.
doing these before we get to the Giza pyramids.
Yeah, no, I think that that's impressive, and I mean, it's amazing that we can summarize 1,000 years in a lecture that takes 1,000 years. No, I'm joking.
Exactly.
If anybody's still listening, I'm just
Right,
joking.
yeah.
No. I think that that's really key because look, you see this is what's important is you get to see this development over time, and it's the kind of thing that we need to show more people because this is 1,000 year history and prehistory to this. That's impressive from the very beginning. You get those very first monuments at Hierankopolis that are probably a site many of you have not even heard of, but that are impressive in and of themselves. And with all those animals even, that shows the sort of
Yeah.
wealth and the effort to memorialize these dead rulers or elite individuals. And so you can sort of see it culminating here. But as you said, pyramids don't stop. This kind of activity of impressive burial in Egypt goes on for another 1,000+ years. So yeah, it's cool to see that in its own way. I mean, they're
Yeah.
wired very differently.
And so hopefully that context just like gives you that understanding that these aren't just popping up out of nowhere. Like they're well established in ancient Egyptian culture.
Yeah, and archaeologists are usually using a lot of evidence again. It's not just sort of saying,
Yeah.
"Oh yeah, this date's here because somebody said it's Khufu or Khafre or whatever." It's like, no, we have all these other independent pieces of evidence from the radiocarbon dating that's been done on these pyramids to all the other sites and the way all this stuff builds up to create this kind of narrative. So, yeah.
Mhm.
Well, thank you for sharing your experience, Beth. I
Thank
think
you.
we all appreciate it, and let's go Sphinx.
All right. All right. Thank you so much. And yeah, that
Cool.
was great.